Hello there, welcome back. You're watching the press preview. It's our first look at what is on the front pages of tomorrow's papers. We'll be checking out the headlines tonight with Novara Media's contributing editor, Moya Lothian-McLean, and Conservative Home's deputy editor, Henry Hill. They'll be with us from now until just before midnight. Very good evening to both of you. We'll chat in a moment after we've had a look at some of those front pages for you, beginning with the Express leading on what it calls horrific images released of the reported murder of Israeli babies by Hamas militants. Israel shows mutilated babies is the headline in The Times. On its front page, The Telegraph warns readers that it's showing one of those images on an inside page because it thinks it's vital to do so. The Sun focuses on one murdered child and asks why the FA won't light up Wembley in Israeli colours tomorrow. While the FT focuses on the US Secretary of State Antony Blinken's assertion that both Israel and Hamas should ensure that civilian casualties are kept as low as possible going forward. The Eye says Britain has made the same plea to both sides as the Royal Navy and RAF are deployed to the area. That story and the promise of US arms for Israel is also the lead item in tomorrow's Guardian. The Mail reports that Rishi Sunak has told police here to get a grip on incidents of anti-Israeli hate. While the Metro reports on the ex-Formula One boss Bernie Ecclestone pleading guilty to fraud, or as the paper puts it, having pulled a fast one. And the Daily Star warns us about an invasion of bedbugs hiding in our furniture. And don't forget, you can scan the QR code that you see on screen during the programme. Take a look at the front pages of the papers while you watch us discussing them. And to do that, Moya Lothian-McLean and Henry Hill. A very good evening to both of you. Nice to see you. And another miserable day of headlines, some dreadful footage once again coming out of the Middle East. Let's start with the front of the Eye. Sunak sends in the military as the UK and US urge Israeli restraint. Moya, urging restraint as it seems inevitable that a ground invasion is on the way.
It says they're urging restraint. We have over the last few days seen what I would call a bit of speaking up both sides of the mouths that kind of comes from Britain and the US. Antony Blinken did a press conference alongside Benjamin Netanyahu where he said, we know you have the ability to defend yourself, but we're sending these weapons to you as a show that the US will always be standing alongside you. I think the single warship that we've sent from the UK is very much in the same vein. And they've said, you know, now these states saying, OK, Israel, we are here, we believe in your absolute right, your obligation, Blinken said, to defend yourself, whatever that is, but also show restraint. But what they're speaking to is a government, Benjamin Netanyahu's government, who has not shown restraint, will not show restraint. If you listen to the Israeli media and a lot of Israeli peace activists on the ground right now, I was talking to a man called Yuri Veltman earlier about this, then a lot of Israelis don't think the far-right extremist government that is currently in charge of Israel are capable of showing restraint when it comes to the question of Gaza, when it comes to the question of Palestine. And the fact that there is no actual call, explicit call to de-escalate, to pull back, to not go ahead with a ground invasion, merely just a suggestion of restraint, but do whatever you think best, is where the position actually is when it comes to the UK and the US on Israel's potential invasion of Gaza.
Yeah, Henry, I mean, it comes down largely to the hostages, doesn't it, and their fate, and what happens there.
Yeah, well, so Israel originally said that it wasn't going to wait for hostage release before going in. Now, does now seem to be hesitating. According to the front page of the Eye, security sources are saying that the window of opportunity for a ground invasion is closing, and presumably if it does close, that will create an impasse. On the one hand, Israel obviously doesn't want those hostages to come to harm. On the other hand, if the taking of hostages forestalls the ground invasion, there's a bit of moral hazard there, because you might argue that it actually validates the hostage-taking as a strategy by Hamas. But Israel doesn't really have at least no easy or winning options at this point. A ground invasion would be a huge policy reversal for them. They withdrew completely in the early 2000s. It would mean an endless ongoing commitment to policing and ruling Gaza, which is a huge responsibility that they don't really want. On the other hand, if they do nothing, they can't do nothing, right? They can't afford to allow this kind of attack on Israel to go as they would see it unanswered. So it's a deeply invidious position that they're in. I suspect, given the balance of power, as Moya was saying, inside the Israeli government, one of the most right-wing governments Israel has ever returned to office, I think, before it became a unity government. I suspect they will end up going in, but we'll have to see.
Yeah, I mean, this is the issue, isn't it? We keep hearing this phrase, mowing the lawn, when you just keep pushing Hamas back. It clearly isn't working, and now the government is saying we need to get rid of Hamas altogether, but there doesn't seem to be much discussion on what on earth happens after that.
There was an extraordinary piece in Haaretz, one of Israel's top newspapers today, by Gideon Levy, who wrote that Israel, the state, is not learning from its past policies when it comes to Palestine, when it comes to Gaza. There's been a blockade on Gaza for 13 years now, a policy of collective punishment. We've all, I think, become very well acquainted with that term in the last few days because of the total blockade that has now been put on Gaza by Israel. But that collective punishment policy, which is deemed a war crime, has been in place for 13 years to some degree. This was judged by the UN in 2020. What this editorial was saying, what this piece was saying, was essentially that the idea of trying to suppress Gaza, suppress the wider Palestinians in the occupied Palestinian territories, this policy of fighting fire with fire is not working. And in fact, Benjamin Netanyahu in 2019 said that funding and bolstering Hamas was the only way to ensure that a Palestinian state was thwarted. It's been part of his strategy to actually support Hamas's presence in Gaza. This is a creation that within Israel, the conversation is turning to Netanyahu, who is the longest tenured prime minister of Israel and probably the most influential politician in Israel in its history, and turning to Netanyahu and looking at his policies over the year and saying, how has the policy towards Gaza, the blockade of Gaza, the policies that we were promised were going to create security, actually perhaps resulted in increasing radicalisation and Hamas rising to power in the first place? How has the occupation led us here in the first place? And is continued doubling down, more violence, more aggression, more occupation actually going to result in any sort of peace?
Yeah, it's a vicious circle, isn't it? Because the people of Israel would say, well, we have to be protected, from the rockets that keep coming.
Yeah, and it's it's very hard to imagine living in a country like this, what it must be like to live in what is a very small country in a precarious situation, most of which can be hit by rockets. So it's an important psychological difference. I think Israel's, in a way, got the worst of both worlds because its policies haven't really at all allowed a viable Palestinian state to emerge. There has been the full blockade of Gaza. There is the partial occupation of the West Bank. But on the other hand, it hasn't taken the responsibility for running Gaza. And you can see the case for if you're going to be doing this, you go in and then you run the water and make sure it runs properly. You build the desalination plant. Instead, what they've done is they've created this weird sort of city-state, which is run by Hamas. And Hamas has diverted all of its resources towards building tunnels and buying weapons. And so that's the worst case for Israel. So I think they need to make a decision, one way or the other. They need to either work much harder to allow a viable Gaza or a viable Palestine, or if they're not prepared to do that, they at least need to shoulder the responsibility. If they're going to be an occupying power, they need to shoulder the responsibility of occupation and actually try and make Gaza work, because otherwise you're just going to end up with this ad infinitum.
Yeah, I just want to bring the front of the FT. Washington urges restraint on Israel as threat of regional conflict mounts. Moya, you wanted to jump in there.
Well, I just think it's an extraordinary argument to make that any state should look at being an occupying power, particularly when we've had so many discussions recently about, the situation in Ukraine and Russia. I think it is bizarre to want to argue that a state should actually occupy another place and not imagine that out of that will come violence, resistance, and probably radicalisation. We've seen this happen. This has been repeated time and time again all over the world. Palestine and Israel is just one example. I think the only solution is obviously to end the occupation and to establish a Palestinian state, which should have been established years ago.
So if there was an easy solution to this, it would have happened a long time ago. But what I was saying is that given where Israel's government is, regardless of whether you think that's a good thing or not, given where Israel's government is, if it is not prepared to try and facilitate a viable independent Palestine, then it should take on the actual responsibilities of being an occupying power, which is what it is. Because currently it's doing neither, right? Yeah. It is denying the Palestinians the ability to stand on their own 2 feet and then refusing or at least taking away their power and water. That's unsustainable.
Yeah, and any sort of solution seems impossible at the moment, doesn't it? Thank you both for the moment. Plenty more still to come on the press preview, including did delays because of COVID lead to Britain's prisons becoming overcrowded? We'll discuss that next. Hello again, welcome back to the press preview. Moya and Henry are with me in the studio still. Let's turn our attention, shall we, to the Daily Express. Henry, prisons are full. We're running out of spaces, and it's being blamed on COVID because so many trials were delayed during the pandemic.
I mean, that is what the government is saying, and that did happen. But one, the prisons were already pretty full. Two, the government recently exacerbated this problem by, I don't know if they legislated so that prisoners, instead of being released automatically or at least being eligible for early release at half their term, it now has to be 2/3. The prison service was immediately like, that's going to cause a massive crisis, and it is. And the government has closed several prisons and not opened any. So it's not really a surprise that we are where we are. I'm sure COVID contributed, but ultimately, if you're going to send more people to prison, keep them there for longer, close some prisons and not open them, this is the kind of headline you end up with.
And have a backlog as well.
Precisely.
And Moya, the government, of course, says they're building 20,000 new prison places.
Well, the government say they're building a lot of things that haven't materialised as of yet. The government also said they're going to rent overseas jail spaces, so we're going to send potentially convicted people overseas now. Part of this is also due to the fact that I think half of every person sentenced to prison in England and Wales every year is sentenced for less than 12 months. We've got a lot of people serving time for minor offences that could be dealt with in other fashions, but unfortunately, that does not seem to come into the discussion of prisons. It's merely, we're going to create more places, we're going to build more prisons. None of that's materialising. We don't have the infrastructure to support it right now, but we aren't looking at the reform of this. Particularly, the criminal justice system is crumbling as it is. You know, lawyers are leaving the profession. We've got judges maxed out. The courts' backlogs are still going on. This crisis is only going to get worse unless we seriously look at the way that we convict for crimes, the way that we treat crime and the way we consider crime, and what's the prison sentence.
Yeah, what is the solution, do you think?
I mean, it depends on your view of criminal justice. Arguably, yes, sending people to large prisons for a short sentence is about the worst thing you can do, because the larger the prison, the more likely it is that they'll get co-socialised with other criminals, and if they're not there for very long, you don't actually do much good in terms of extracting them from the community. Ironically, HMP Lancaster, one of the small prisons that the government shut in 2011, had one of the lowest recidivism rates in the prison system. And I think that actually, if you're going to do that, smaller prisons, where you've got less opportunities to socialise with organised crime and so on, would be the solution. But that would mean building prisons in a lot of MPs' constituencies rather than a few MPs' constituencies, so it's probably never going to happen.